Good morning, everybody. It's Colin Talbot again, talking to a group of colleagues based in the UK, mainly about what's going on in the UK in terms of the government and government's responses to the coronavirus crisis. But also, I'm probably drawing on some international examples as we go through. So the easiest thing to do is to go around and ask people to introduce themselves. So I'll start with Ian.
Hi Colin, my name's Ian Elliott. I'm chair of the PAC, so that's why I'm here today as part of this PAC panel. I'm also an academic at Northumbria University.
Thank you very much. Eduardo, I'm just going round anti-clockwise. Eduardo.
Hi everybody. Hello everybody, good morning. I'm Eduardo Ongaro, Professor of Public Management at the Open University, and I'm also an editor of Public Policy and Administration, a journal of PAC, and also a co-author who is here too in the panel, Claire. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hi, hello everyone. Hi, I'm Catherine Farrell, academic at Cardiff University, Programme Director for our Masters in Public Leadership, and also co-editor of the Teaching Public Administration Journal.
Thank you. John?
So good morning, everyone. John Diamond. I'm the other co-editor of Teaching Public Administration, and I'm a professor of public policy and professional practice at Edge Hill University here in the UK.
Thanks, John. Claire, sorry.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So I'm a professor of public policy at the University of Exeter. I'm also Vice Chair of the UK Political Studies Association, and along with Eduardo, I co-edit Public Policy and Administration Journal.
Thank you very much, everybody. Right, so I thought we'd just kick off with getting your thoughts about how you think British governments, plural, have been doing, and that can be comments on what central government's been doing at Westminster, but also the devolved governments and local governments, because there have been some increasingly disparate responses to the crisis. So maybe if we go around in reverse order. Claire, would you like to go first?
Sure. So, well, I suppose everything that I say in this, and also everything that I've been reading and thinking about what's going on, especially in the UK, across the nations and jurisdictions, there's a big caveat that I want to put on all of that, and this is kind of classic academic, which is we're watching something in motion just now. And I'm reading a lot that really, in some ways, worries me about kind of, you know, offering a verdict on a moving target is very difficult, and especially if you're a scholar of public policy and administration, very often the implications of what's happened and the verdict, if you like, is only going to become clear years down the line. So that's the kind of classic academic caveat before I say anything. I think the main thing that I've been struck by, kind of analytically trying to think about what's going on for the whole of the UK, is it takes me back to this, you know, a really great thing that Waldavsky wrote a long time ago called the law of large solutions. And I think there's a lot going on here that tells us about the law of large solutions. So we have these huge solutions, policy solutions that cast massive implications, and we had that with austerity, all those years of cutting back, and we have that with devolution, fragmentation of government, and also of course with Brexit more recently. And I think the UK and the way that the UK has been able to respond, and the capacity problems that this is really revealing across the nations of the UK, tells us a lot about that law of large solutions. We have these huge policy programmes from across the years with austerity, and with Brexit and devolution, and here we have the state capacity, which is extremely weak and fragmented in lots of ways. So whenever I'm looking at this, I'm not necessarily trying to work out, you know, how badly are they all doing, but more analytically, I'm trying to think of how should I understand this? How should I understand how we've got to the position we're in the UK, where quite clearly we're not having a good a good crisis for in terms of public policy, in terms of governance, and more importantly, in terms of our citizens.
Yeah, thank you. I thought there was a very good piece in The Guardian a couple of days ago by Martin Kettle, and he made a point that the coronavirus clearly attacks people with weak underlying immune systems and so on, but it was also doing the same to governments, that it was exposing governments that had major problems and it was exacerbating them. John, do you want to come in?
Yes, I mean, thank you, Claire, for providing the cover for all of us today. That's really, really useful. I think that what strikes me, there are two things. One is a kind of, as the observer, like we all are in different ways, but the second is each week I've been having quite a long conversation with one of the key people who sits around the Resilience Forum in the Merseyside city region. So been listening to her experiences and her reflections on the last week and looking ahead. So as the observer, it seems to me in a way the government has almost, if there's a playbook, they've either read it back to front or lost it. So there's an interesting question at some point, and we're asking it now, but at some point further down the line, the question will be, did they act too late? Did they act about the right time? Why was Britain slightly the one out of step with the rest of the world? But the second, and this is the point, which in terms of my conversations, it's really interesting because in those weekly telephone conversations, you get an insight into 10 years of austerity, into the kind of fragmentation of local government, into the space that the city region that's been introduced in England more recently, and therefore the elected mayors, the space that they're occupying. And then the enormous network of not just voluntary organisations and public agencies, but organisations like the fire service, British Gas. So who's delivering the food bank parcels in Liverpool? It's British Gas meter readers. Who's delivering the goods to the individuals who are described as being shielded? In other words, they have to stay at home, they've got to be protected. It's the Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service, and Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service. So there's some really interesting things coming out of this, which are partly, I think, to do with networks on the ground that often are invisible to central state actors. And that says something about, even after 10 years of cuts at local authority level, something about the resilience, perhaps, of some key individuals and organisations, but maybe we'll be rewriting the discussion papers on elected mayors in a few years' time as we look back over this, because of the three key mayors in England, I think, at different degrees, but the two in the Northwest have certainly, I think, made an impact. That's Andy Burnham and Steve Rotheram. I think that's one of the unforeseen stories of this virus.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. I have to declare an interest at this point. I'm one of the 2 million or so who are supposed to be shielded. I eventually got my letter telling me that I was in that category on the 25th of April, which shows you the gap between what's being said at the top about what's going on and what's actually happening on the ground. It took, 6 weeks into the lockdown before I got told officially I was in that category. Catherine, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, for me, based in Wales, Northern Ireland, obviously is my background, but based in Wales, I think huge issues for devolution, and clearly then tensions between the UK government and also the Welsh government. It's been really focused on a number of issues. One has been about equipment, the PPE equipment, and also the tests. And sometimes, the UK government will make an announcement at sort of 5:30 in the day at those press meetings, and it doesn't apply in Wales. So immediately there's this retraction by the Welsh government to say, sorry, that's not, this is our messages from the Welsh government. So clearly big differences, big issues around devolution. And currently then, the lockdown has sort of been eased in England, but has not been eased in Wales. So the Welsh First Minister has constantly got to put out the message, you know, this does not apply to Wales. Wales, the clear message is to stay at home. Tensions for people, I think, because clearly we get our news from the UK government, we get our news from the BBC, and often it's started to become a little bit more apparent. They often use the term now, and this applies to England as opposed to other countries. So there's a little bit more in terms of the national coverage that this is an English-based policy. But, you know, confusing messages, I think, for a lot of people who may not really understand the differences between what the UK government are saying or what Boris is saying, because we think of Boris as the PM for the country, but actually there's a First Minister in Wales who says other things. So bit of confusion for people, I think, and also tensions around the borders now. There's talk about, you know, policing the borders to make sure that people in England, there's a little bit of issues there, are not coming to Wales to drive 200 or 300 miles to have a walk in the Brecon Beacons or to come to a beach or something. So, you know, policing the borders, I've never heard language like this before, really. There's been a kind of, England and Wales hasn't really had that kind of relationship before. But obviously there are different laws now that apply in Wales, and for the Welsh people in Wales to understand those, and for the UK government to understand their messages, it's been real, you know, real issues for us here in Wales.
Yeah, I wonder if I could pick up on your Northern Irish background and just ask about, because one of the things there, I've seen, I think, 3 interviews now with Arlene Foster on the BBC, or heard 3 interviews, where she's not once been asked about the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and she's not said anything about the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and I just find that bizarre. I just wondered if you've been following that.
It's a very interesting one. I know Ian has the same background as myself, but that has been an interesting one. From the beginning, she said, you know, she was following the UK government's line on things, and actually Ireland has survived this so far so good. And I think Claire's caveat at the beginning to say that, you know, this is a moving target. I think we need to put the date on these, because today is whatever, the 15th of May. You know, we're looking at this at the 15th of May, and things will change as this pandemic moves on. But I think very early on she said she was following the UK government, and I think that was a bit of a mistake, because Ireland is so far so good, been doing quite well on this. But her relationship with her Deputy First Minister has been quite a close one, actually, and we see them stand every day together, and I think that's been a positive thing that's come out of this. And I think other things that have come out of it really are, you know, whether you're, you know, in one community or the other, actually you don't really care where your good food is coming from, or you don't care where your supplies are coming from. So I think there's around communities, local communities have come together in ways that we wouldn't have expected them to in the old traditional kind of backgrounds that people have come from. So that's been a positive thing as well.
That's interesting. Eduardo, would you like to come in?
Yes, I'd like also to shift our focus to the international level. So from the devolved administrations to the international level. I think probably exactly because this is a moving target, any government in the world will need to do a lot of international policy learning, lesson drawing. Of course, it's difficult to do that because it's a moving target, but it's also the key major source of way of building a capacity through learning. And I think we should focus this a lot. Myself, as an Italy-born scholar, of course, what struck me a lot back in March was the slightly dismissive attitude, the non-attention paid to what was going on in Italy seriously. And I think those 2 weeks might have been fatal to some extent. And of course, you can learn also from the most tragic and dramatic cases. But I think going on for all governments all over the world, and also for international organizations in facilitating this, but themselves in learning, what we really need to do also as scholars is to try how to distill the mechanisms that work underlying the practices that are put in place by governments, and how context makes the difference, but adapting from context to context, we can learn a lot. And I think this will be a key message and also a key job for us as scholars going on.
Thanks, Eduardo. That's very interesting. Ian.
Yes, thanks, Colin. completely agree with everything there so far, and just picking up on what Claire said, you know, it's absolutely right. Of course, this is a moving target, and it's very, very difficult to draw any clear conclusions at this stage. The PAC is a learned society. We're the UK Learned Society for, you know, public policy, administration, and social work, and so we represent universities across the UK. And what I think has become clear as this crisis continues is just how much public service really matters. There's a huge, you know, demand now for research. There's lots of funding calls coming out. There's a huge demand for research into this and into how different parts of the public sector are dealing with this, and a huge demand for knowledge around how public services work and how public management and administration works. But at the same time, you know, we know as public administration scholars that there's been a huge cut in training budgets. There's been a huge cut in the number of people working within public administration in the UK. In fact, I think Peter Barbaras in 2012 wrote about how, you know, public administration had become the craft that dare not speak its name in the UK. You know, just given how much contraction there has been. We still see that today, and I think, you know, there's a real challenge. Some people are kind of arguing that maybe this will represent some sort of resurgence in public sector, that suddenly we'll all come out of this and we'll realise how important you know, the local government is, and how important other parts of the public sector are. But at the same time, we're facing threats to, for example, the status of apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships within the UK, and the PAC has responded to the ongoing consultation on that. And you know, we can see across the UK that there are fewer and fewer universities that are teaching public administration. So I think, you know, we as a learned society have a key role to play in actually thinking not just about how governments are doing today, but actually how we can build better, more capacity and develop better public leaders for the future.
That's an interesting point. And I think John wanted to say something about the issue of developing public leaders for the future. John?
Yes, I think there's probably a long list of things that we need to be thinking about and that we'll learn out of this process. But it certainly seems to me that there are probably two important ones. One more immediate one, perhaps, for senior leaders, executive leaders, is the providing support as they reflect back on their roles and what they've been doing and the expectations associated with them. I mean, I can see that in universities we should be kind of positioning ourselves as the support and the kind of reservoir of knowledge and understanding about that. And I think that's going to be really important. I think the examples that we're observing, whether in any field, education, social work, public service more generally, leaders are having to be really inventive and developing probably a whole set of skills of persuasion as well as advocacy that they might not have thought they needed. So there's the role of leaders. And I think what goes with that, something that was on the news this morning, which is about the impact on mental health and well-being. I know that a member of the UK PAC has been carrying out research with fire and rescue personnel who are involved in the Manchester arena bombing, and there are quite important lessons to understand around the emergency response, not just in technical operational terms, but in emotional and mental health terms. There's that. And the second, I think, area is it may well be that we're kind of witnessing, this is one of those things that we can't be sure, but we may well be witnessing the emergence of local authorities as an agency or a unit that exercises more influence, more visibility. And I think there'll be a job to be done helping weave together and patch together issues to do with place, concepts of collaboration, networking, and so on. So I think there are things that we are quite skilled at doing. And what the virus, I think, is illustrating is the kind of some of the gaps in knowledge, as opposed to the sheer getting on with it and making it happen. And I think our role has to be to support that, add a layer of learning, and perhaps enable people to to be able to reflect more critically about what has happened.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I want to a little bit be slightly provocative and challenge the thing that Claire said at the beginning a little bit about to what extent have public administration scholars actually stepped up to do the speaking truth to power bit. You know, we know an awful lot about how public administration can work and can work together at, for example, multi-level governance issues and the role of local government and all of those sorts of things. And I suppose I err slightly in the other direction, and I've written already stuff about how I think the Westminster government's response to this especially has been massively over-centralised, and whenever they've been confronted with a choice of handing over things to the devolved or local governments, they've not done it, and they've actually gone in the other direction and centralised lots of stuff. And I just wonder whether or not we as a profession, as academics, knowing all of that, I ought to be stepping up more and saying what's going wrong. And the other point, I think I totally take John's point, and I think there's huge amounts of learning to come out of these sorts of crises. It's not on the YouTube channel yet, but I've been talking to colleagues in Puerto Rico about how they've dealt with some much bigger crises in the last few years, particularly the devastating hurricanes that they've had, and the response there. And I think some of the lessons coming out of that are really, really interesting. So I just wondered about that issue about, you know, are we challenging what I call the misorganisation of the response to the crisis adequately enough? Anybody?
Yeah.
Ian, go on.
I think the challenge we've got here is that it is such a mixed picture. I think the one thing that I would pick up on in what you've said is that actually devolution in a way could have been a real strength, that could have been a real asset in developing, you know, really localized responses to this, and yet the UK government have kind of chosen to adopt a fairly centralized approach without really appreciating at times the devolved nature of, you know, health and social care, for example, and that then has created tensions and mixed messages. But I wouldn't necessarily start pointing fingers around that, because I don't really think that helps anybody in a way. I mean, I know, for example, I was talking to somebody the other day who runs a large construction company in England, but they have workers in Scotland and they have contracts in Scotland. The Scottish workers are saying, well, we're being told to stay at home. But they're an English company and they're saying, look, everybody needs to go back to work now. We're a key sector of the economy. We need to go back to work. Now, who's right or wrong in that? It's, you know, it's a fairly difficult situation to kind of be able to say, well, clearly, you know, Scotland are doing it right by staying at home, or clearly, you know, England are doing it right by trying to, you know, re-stimulate the economy again. It's not quite as black and white as that. Similarly, there have been cases around, you know, for example, been many cases in care homes in Scotland, and I think something like 45% of all the COVID cases in Scotland have occurred in care homes. There's clearly issues around that, but at the same time there are other aspects of the Scottish Government's approach that are being praised. So, you know, I don't think it's as simple as saying, you know, one government is doing particularly well, or, you know, one government isn't doing particularly well. At the same time, you know, we saw today on Radio 4, you know, Martin Gannon from Gateshead talking about how, you know, so much of the data is being centralised and not shared at a regional level. Undoubtedly, there could be things done more at regional levels and at local levels, but at the same time, the government are trying to have consistency and trying not to have mixed messages. So it's just a hugely complex situation. And what I think does come out of all of this is just how much public service really matters and how much these things are hugely important. You know, we should be talking about these things. We should be teaching these subjects, you know, not just to civil servants, but actually, you know, in standard business programs, we should be debating these issues, because the very nature of public service is that we're grappling with these hugely complex issues and you know, wicked problems, as we like to talk about.
I I think just on that, one of the interesting things from the interviews I've been doing globally is that some of the countries that are doing really well have done really well by doing different things to one another. So, you know, for example, South Korea and New Zealand have both done really well, but they've adopted very different strategies for dealing with the virus. And it's going to be interesting to see when the dust settles on all of this. You know, why is it the case that different strategies worked really well in different countries? Eduardo, could I just ask you about the Italian dimension to this? I mean, what's the levels, from the discussions I've had before, there's been some tension between central government in Italy and the federal level responses, and the regional level responses, and also between some of the regions that there've been very different responses.
Yes, absolutely. That's a key, I think, a point to look at if we wanted to learn something out of that. I see two lessons here. One is, of course, when you are the first to be struck by something like that, at least in the West, because especially in Eastern Asia, there were already some experiences, or at least alarms that rang loudly in the past years. So somehow there was a sense that a lockdown could be something possible, but in the West, this perception was not spread, at least in the population. And so I think there is one thing which is a sort of collective learning from what happened in Italy, and then one thing on your question of differential regional responses, because Italy is a regionalized healthcare system, which means there are 20 different healthcare. There is one national healthcare system, but 20 different ways of organizing it, and there is evidence that some regions responded better than others, and we can learn from that. But on the first point first, I think what has happened in Italy was an incredibly quick learning, accelerated crash learning process, because the realization that first the northern region of Lombardy and then the whole of Italy would have needed to go into lockdown was really a sort of collective learning processes going on in sort of 1 week, not just between the experts and the policymakers, but across the population, to realize that now it seems natural that most of the countries in the world should or will or might enter and exit lockdowns. But I think there is still a little bit to learn about what it means to get 60 million people to realize that a new way of life has happened upon them in 1 week without having any other foreign experience again to look at and watch on TV. This is the first point. And the second one, and very briefly, and on this I would conclude the round on what we can learn from Italy. But it seems emerging evidence, with all the caveats of dealing with a moving target, that regions which are stronger on the system of territorial healthcare and the GPs responded much better than regions which were very strong in terms of their hospital services, but were weaker in terms of their territorial presence or ability to mobilize both public resources and community resources on the territory to test and track and quash the virus where it happened. I think this is a key lesson for me.
Thanks. Catherine, do you want to just come in and say something about the response in Wales? Because obviously it's increasingly diverging from the response in Westminster and Whitehall. And I wondered, but I also wondered about, having lived in Wales myself, as you know, about the differentiation within Wales, because, you know, the South Wales conurbations, I presumably, are experiencing a very different level and type of problems from the rest of Wales.
Yeah. Clearly there was an issue, and still is an issue, in South Wales around the Newport area, and some data issues actually in North Wales, where the data wasn't actually being recorded properly on a daily basis. I think they've ironed out some of those issues now, but clearly, you know, the One Health Board experienced major issues. This virus does seem to be more urban than it does rural, and so rural parts of Wales have not experienced the same kind of rates. And actually, some of those rural areas are often tourist areas as well, and so the people in those areas have been you know, local people with roadblocks, please do not come here, signs all over. Obviously, I can see them on the videos as opposed to me going there and seeing these signs, but, you know, please do not come here. But local people out, you know, stopping people going, tourists going to their area. You know, people get reported if they're, you know, from another place and they go to the medics in that area to renew their prescription and so on. So local people in tourist areas are really, really cautious about, you know, the virus reaching parts of rural Wales. So there's tensions across Wales, and obviously there is a perception that, you know, it's based in Cardiff, it's based in Newport, and these areas have higher levels of virus and tensions across Wales as a result of that, I think.
Right.
But it also, I mean, the virus itself does highlight the importance of other professionals having an input into the debate. So it's not just, you know, people who are interested in public management who are going to solve some of these issues. Actually, we see the psychologists coming in. You know, I think the UK government's perception was that in a democracy, people were not going to do what the government told them, i.e. stay at home. But we have stayed at home. Now, we haven't stayed at home because the government told us to. We've stayed at home because we're actually quite afraid of the virus. And so, you know, people's own logic and their own perceptions about their safety have taken over, rather than we do what we're told because the government tell us to. So, you know, I think that, you know, it's good to see psychologists and other people coming in to share this. One of the courses I teach in Cardiff, and I'm not plugging my course now or anything, but it is the challenge focus. In order to resolve problems and challenges, and this is the biggest challenge we will ever face in our lives, and, you know, I hope we all look back on this time and remember it all, because we could easily forget parts of it, but really we need to think about things from all of these different perspectives, and that, you know, resolving this bit has an impact on things over there, and we need to think of it as a big jigsaw, and when we try and do one bit of it, we need to think of the impact on other parts of our community or our lives, really. And so, you know, it shows the importance of interprofessional collaborative working as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it's also important at the policy advice level. The interview I did with Jeff Mulgan about how they set up the civil contingencies process, one of the things he emphasised was, yeah, it's no good having expert panels. You've got to make sure you've got the right experts in the room to deal with things. And one of the things that struck me, which we need to investigate in the future, and this is very impressionistic, is that there's actually been, on a lot of these expertise committees, there's been very little public administration input. People who actually understand how systems are organised. So you can have epidemiological evidence, which is great and is really useful and is quite sophisticated, but unless you know how to act on it and use it well and understand the systems that you need to operate to make it work, it's extremely difficult. Claire, did you want to come back in?
Sure. I'm kind of mulling over what your provocation, Colin, about, you know, the PA scholars stepping up. And it is interesting. I mean, there's been a lot out there in the academic kind of blog sphere world. A lot of our colleagues are writing about this. I mean, we're certainly all thinking about it, I think that's for sure. But I think there's also something about public policy and admin scholars that because we know so much, we know that perhaps there's an issue of timing. So when we're able to say something with robust evidence that we feel confident is going to be listened to, and generating robust evidence is a major part of our craft, and it's one of the main things that separates us from journalists and other specialists. You know, we actually have we want to have a claim to authoritative evidence, and that takes time. So lots of us are busy, you know, putting in grant applications here and there for all of these calls that are going on just now. But there's also another issue that we all know from public policy and admin scholarship, which is there's too much knowledge out there. There's too much expertise out there for high-level decision-maker attention to listen to. Now, what I think we miss, and what speaks to the very last point you made probably, is we miss an advocacy organisation that we can coalesce around. Yes, we have PAC, yes, we have PSA, but these are learned societies, and quite rightly, their energies are trying to are deployed at the moment into defending higher education, defending our students, defending our colleagues in departments that are very vulnerable just now, and on the ground it's very difficult. So we do miss an advocacy organisation that could get us in the room, that could get us onto these committees for sure, which is where you get the high level attention. So it's stepping up, yes, but it's finding a mechanism where that's going to be efficient and useful, and where you can channel the expertise of big communities of scholars like us.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, and I'd be interested to see how NAPA in the United States works, the National Academy for Public Administration, which is made up of a mixture of academics and former practitioners, and I think does play that sort of role and is regularly called on by the federal government when they have some sort of complex, wicked issue problem that they want some public administration input into. So I think that's really interesting. And just on your point about the academic sort of journalistic divide, I have to confess I've been sneaking over the border into journalism in recent years a lot more than academia, as well as academia. So I suppose I have a slightly different perspective on it. Can we just do a quick round, because we're running out of time, just quick, anything that you think we've missed in this discussion so far? And I'm sure we can come back and do a further one in the future, because this issue is not going to go away either in the short term in terms of the epidemic, or, as I think Claire was emphasising from the beginning, the long-term lessons are going to have to be learned from this. So could we do a quick run round? Claire, do you want to go first? Oh, John wants to go first.
No, I'm fine. It's fine. So
Claire?
I think there's two things, and both revolve around the point about learning, and this is obviously academically it's what I write about a lot. I think it's incredibly interesting that the very low level of policy transfer that we're seeing across the world in this, and the policy transfer that we're seeing there's a lot of suboptimal policy transfer. So we're back to our old friend context matters. So I think there's a very fruitful line of discussion to have about that dimension of learning, and then the dimension of learning that John and that Ian have spoken to about how we use what we learn from this in our MPAs and in our teaching.
Right, that's useful. Thanks, John.
So just two quick ones. One, it is fascinating in the sense that, unlike other crises or natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, this is global. So there is something interesting. I don't mean interesting as in an academic sense, but I mean in asking how governments have responded. So it's Claire's point, but it's at real time. So it's not like this happened a year ago and now it's happening here. We're kind of living in that moment. So the extent to which central states are able to respond quickly to what is happening, very close to is fascinating, or their lack of. And the second one, which again goes back to the centralisation issue and SAGE and COBRA and those central agencies. So if I'm right in thinking that the Mayor of London managed to get him a place at the table because of London's kind of uniqueness as a global city. There is some, and the devolved nations and regions have argued to be involved. There is something I think that might come out of this, which is the over-centralisation meant that there was very little local intelligence around what's happening at a regional level and sub-regional level. My point then about elected mayors. So that may be one of the lessons that was not kind of foreseen or anticipated, that their significance would be elevated in the context of a national crisis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's been quite clear that there have been huge regional variations in the degree of the epidemic. You know, the southwest has been very low. For example, the east of England, where I live now, has been relatively low because we haven't got any big conurbations apart from Cambridge. Catherine.
For me, I think it's about the relationships between governments and how, you know, the UK government and Welsh and other devolved governments relate to each other, and understanding each other's powers. And I suppose the media and how they've learnt particularly over this pandemic, how devolution has changed things across the UK.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. Eduardo? Eduardo? Oh, he's frozen. Ian, do you want to go while we wait for Eduardo to reconnect?
Yes, of course, Colin.
Well, pay attention to its importance.
Sorry, Eduardo, you froze for a minute there. Would you like to repeat your comment? Hello, Eduardo, can you hear me? No, it looks like you can't.
Sorry, I missed the connection, right?
Yeah. So we didn't get your comment. So would you like to do it again?
Yeah. Now we're back. Yes, thank you. Sorry. So no, I think the key message is comparative public administration and comparative public policy is back. But the point is that this time there might be a sense in which decision makers will also realize that it may be a valuable source of learning. So I hope this time this can be placed also on the decision makers' agenda.
Yeah, I hope that's true, but the decision of the Westminster government to stop putting up the international comparative chart doesn't bode well for discussions about comparative lesson learning. Ian, final comment.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Thank you very much for organising this PAC panel. I think what you can see from what everybody said is just how much research is actually going on at the minute into this issue. The PAC, you know, we represent universities, we hold conferences and events, we publish the 2 journals, and we fund research ourselves, and all of our activities as a learned society will continue to support public administration scholars within the UK to develop more insights and more research into how to not just deal with the current crisis, but actually how to develop better systems of government and in particular regional governance in the future. Quite a lot of my colleagues at Northumbria University are already involved at a local level within the northeast of England, and as you've heard from everybody else, there's lots of research going on right across the UK. So my hope from all of this is that we will see more of that research being delivered into research-informed teaching within universities, so that, you know, we can develop leaders, but also, you know, those that are the kind of street level bureaucrat, if you like, of the future, who will be better able to respond to the next crisis.
Thanks very much, Ian. I think this is the 16th interview that we've done, which are all on the YouTube channel, and this one will be there very shortly. If anybody wants to record interviews, discussions themselves locally and add them to that database of stuff, which I think is going to be quite useful for the future, both nationally and internationally, please do. Just take the initiative and get in touch with me about the technical details, and we'll put it up on the YouTube channel. That would be great. So thank you all for joining me this morning. We've run slightly over for people who've got to leave to do other things, but thanks a lot, and nice to see you all again. I think I've talked to more people in the last 6 weeks than I've talked to in the last 6 years. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everybody.
much, Colin. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Thank you.